Seen and heard okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great.
Hello and welcome to the fourth session of David Auerbach's From Leibniz to Google, 5 Paradigms of Artificial Intelligence. David, please.
Hi, welcome to more on cybernetics. I hope to get to the start of symbolic artificial intelligence, the next paradigm at the towards the end of this session, but I wanted to, since we had a really good discussion on cybernetics last time, there was some stuff we didn't quite cover, and I wanted to finish it up and discuss some of the larger implications of what cybernetics amounted to. Last time we focused primarily on the McCulloch and Pitts paper on the potential logical representations of nervous networks, and in many ways it can be considered the founding text of cybernetics. Their goal was to create a logical and also temporal representation of the activities of the neurons in the brain. I imagine that it may be surprising to see Bergson come up as much as he has, that both Wiener and McCulloch invoke him, because Bergson is not necessarily thought of as anything resembling someone who would have had influence in this, but temporality and time is something that I think has always evaded I guess formal capture, since, you know, if you were to ask someone, well, how fast does time flow? They can only say it flows at 1 second per second. And are any of you familiar with McTaggart's arguments against McTaggart's arguments against time? The A series, B series, and C series. McTaggart was one of the British idealists, the British Hegelian idealists, who went completely out of fashion around the turn of the century. Bertrand Russell was briefly an idealist before rejecting it altogether. But these people wrote very British works about very German thinkers, and for that alone, I think they're interesting. But McTaggart also had a philosophy of time that still makes itself felt in a lot of analytic arguments, and he claimed that sort of the entire, in a very analytic way, that the entire notion of time was incoherent. So anyway, but as von Neumann pointed out in the response section in his paper, there were some serious questions as to just how feasible it was that McCulloch and Pitts's representations could capture the sheer magnitude of Is Jesse being pinned right now, or is that just me? Okay, I pinned Jesse. Sorry about that. Okay. Von Neumann said that he wasn't sure if a human-made nervous network could fit in the known universe. And that's actually surprisingly pessimistic from von Neumann, since he tended to be rather ambitious and optimistic. So what Norbert Wiener does when he gets McCulloch and Pitts and the neurologist Jerome Letvin into a research group at MIT in the late 1940s is that he takes this general approach and he gives it the name cybernetics. And he extends the idea of mathematical modeling of biological or otherwise organic or complex processes with two other areas in particular: information theory, which is the field that comes out of signal processing, and applied statistics, which is itself the other primary field that information theory draws on. And what Wiener comes up with is a significant variant on McCulloch and Pitts's approach, because Wiener is not only concerned with the mind, but with the larger workings of society, of the world, of nature, of human society, and politics included. So in effect, he's taking McCulloch and Pitts's approach and he's generalizing it to say that, well, okay, if we can model the nervous system in a temporal temporal way with formal logic, can we do the same to any other biological or social phenomena? And again, while Wiener is very interested in mechanization, computer science qua computer science doesn't play a huge role in his work. He references it, but not in the way that, say, that Alan Turing or even von Neumann does. Wiener's orientation is rather that of looking at ecosystems. He wants to treat ensembles of organisms, not atomically programmed computers. Given an organism, any organism, how does it manage to fulfill its goals, the chief goal being survival, in a particular environment in which it is embedded? And the principle to which Wiener adheres is that the model of an organism coping with its environment exists prior to formal logic and reasoning. In the same way that evolutionary biology looks at how biology serves the goals of evolution and natural selection, and in the same way that evolutionary psychology often overstates how this or that psychological exists purely for the sake of reproductive fitness, in the sense of Richard Dawkins' selfish gene. In that same way, what Wiener terms logical thinking is posterior to the biological limits of the human organism. And I think Eric quoted this passage last week, which I'm just going to reiterate. It was on page 125 of Wiener's book. Psychology contains much that is foreign to logic, but, and this is the important fact, any logic which means anything to us can contain nothing which the human mind, and hence the human nervous system, is unable to encompass. All logic is limited by the limitations of the human mind when it is engaged in that activity known as logical thinking. And I believe that I think Stanislav Lem actually says something very, very similar in Summa Technologiae, where he says that it would be very surprising if the entirety of the universe's workings could be captured by reasoning processes attainable by the human nervous system. So to this end, Wiener deploys two key concepts with regard to an organism's self-regulation, in the same way that McCulloch and Pitts talked about their nervous networks being regulated or self-regulating. And those two concepts are feedback and homeostasis, and they're closely related. Feedback is the same concept as circularity, which McCulloch and Pitts spoke about extensively as being the central principle that extends, that really makes nervous networks capable of very complex operations. But when McCulloch and Pitts spoke about circularity in the nervous networks, they purely meant networks of neurons that were not wholly linear, that didn't have a clear starting point and an ending point, but had one or more loops in them. And they noted that the introduction of cycles into nervous networks made them incredibly more complicated and much harder to model, so that they had to introduce this Bergsonian temporal element into their model, where instead of only presenting one static representation of a network, they have to present a logical representation of a succession of temporal snapshots of a network, because the cycles in the network cause the network to change and evolve over time. If you have a sequence of neurons and there's a cycle in them, as soon as the output of one neuron causes a change in the inputs to a neuron earlier in the sequence, then the output of the nervous network at one time may be different from that of another time. And that is the fundamental concept of feedback. The network feeds back onto itself, and you have a succession of temporal states that change based on the feedback process. So Wiener takes this concept of feedback and he makes it almost into a metaphysical principle. He generalizes the notion of feedback far beyond the neuron. Now, instead of networks of neurons, you effectively have networks of organisms. And by organisms, anything, whether they're neurons, robots, animals, humans, or abstract political, socio-political, economic entities. Wiener really is proposing cybernetics as a general science. Each organism has inputs from its surrounding environment and from other organisms, which are in that environment, and from that, the organism generates various outputs. And these outputs, of course, affect the same organisms and environment from which it gathered input, and thus you have feedback in the most basic sense. And the corresponding regulatory principle Wiener applies to feedback is that of homeostasis. Homeostasis is simply the ability of a system or organism to maintain itself in a certain state, whether that state is having a body temperature of 98.6 degrees, having a heart rate that is somewhere between 60 and 120, or simply the state of not being dead, the state of, you know, being mobile and alive. And this gets at the essence of the cybernetics as the study of control. Cyber being being a Greek root meaning control or helming a ship. So putting control as how can an organism control both itself and exert control over its environment to maintain homeostasis of one sort or another. And the simplest and classic example here is a thermostat. If it gets too hot, the thermostat turns on the air conditioner and cools it. If it gets too cold, the thermostat turns on the heater. The input signal is the current temperature. The outputs are the triggers sent to the heater and the air conditioner to turn them on or off. And the goal of the system is to maintain homeostasis at whatever the target temperature is. From a cybernetic point of view, you look at this as, okay, well, a thermostat doesn't want it to just be flipping things off and on because there's always a lag in terms of how the heating and air conditioning affect it. So you want it to not simply react to, you know, the temperature at that given moment, but actually take into account something of the history. And this process is called hysteresis, or sort of smoothing the adjustment curve. And this all falls under the what one might call cybernetic analysis. And you can extend the notion of homeostasis to living organisms by way of body temperature, heart rate, and the rest. You can extend it to any entity if you look at it as having mathematically modelable relations that involve adjusting to changing inputs in such a way as to maintain constancy among some properties of itself in relation to its environment. And this, though Wiener doesn't say so explicitly, is a mechanism of intelligence if we define intelligence as the ability of an organism to endure shifting conditions and not simply be tossed about by them. And that gets back to what I said earlier, that logic and thinking are posterior in the cybernetic view to the central idea of controlling and maintaining one's relation to the environment. If that environment is the real world, whatever we might define that to be, and the organism has sufficiently well-defined and measurable goals, we start to see what a cybernetician would consider intelligence in the broadest possible sense.
One question.
Uh-huh.
Do you hear? Is there no feedback between the microphone and so one can hear me clear? Because I don't have my headphones on today.
Right.
Okay, so you can hear me.
You're talking about feedback?
Yeah, no, on my computer and the microphone. I wanted to ask.
That's an interesting case of cybernetics, is whether we could consider that feedback. And I think that was actually an inspiration for Wiener. Oh, but you're talking about something else.
Yeah. I just want, if the audio is okay, because my headphones don't work today. I just want to ask if then when Wiener says that these general abilities to control oneself and one's environment to a certain extent is generally said to be intelligence. That intelligence is not coextensive with rational thinking that is representable in formal logic. That intelligence is a broader term, and yeah.
Yes, and moreover, intelligence is in some ways, you can either think of it as being secondary in the regard that intelligence is something that pops out of cybernetic systems, that, you know, that there are these requirements that homeostatic organisms need to fulfill, and intelligence is one of the ways in which they can be fulfilled. Alternately, we can say that in fulfilling that process, what results is inevitably intelligence, or there's nothing over and above that to intelligence, because that's all there is. If you want to pull it out of it, you're just saying, okay, well, you know, you're building a castle in the air. Does that make sense?
So that one needs to differentiate between, okay, either every system that has these cybernetic characteristics is already intelligent or does show intelligent behavior, or
no.
No.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, that what I understood, that one could say, okay, either it is automatically intelligent behavior if it shows these cybernetics characteristics, but then every system is basically intelligent. in this regard, or that one differentiate between, okay, cybernetic, these mechanisms of feedback and homeostasis, but that isn't automatically intelligence, and that intelligence is something more specific.
I
but
think
which
they would.
is out of this.
I think they would tend to go towards the second answer, but I think that I want to go back. I want to go back to Valentino Breitenberg, because I think embodying the cybernetic perspective here, in which she's saying that intelligence is an anthropocentric construct that is imposed on systems that meet certain requirements, certain arbitrary criteria that we've put on them. That, you know, intelligence isn't something that you just find in the wild. What you find in the wild is are these ecosystems that when you study, you look at them, and at a certain point you say, yeah, that one's good enough to be intelligent. And so as you go through the Breitenberg book, he starts saying, yeah, can't you see how this is starting to appear intelligent? So it's sort of saying that intelligence isn't a great metric, because it's something that is not it's not quite the same measurable property, because it's much more subjective, and it's more relativistic. And the cybernetician's conceit is that look, we've got our mathematical models, and you know, we can measure just how much an organism can cope with its environment. And you may say, okay, well, that's more or less intelligent, but that is simply a less precise way of speaking than what we're talking about. That makes sense?
Yes. Okay, thanks.
Cool. No, it's a good question, and I think that, I think it's sort of at the core, and it's that especially when we get to symbolic AI, when the question sort of turns around and they start saying, nonsense, we know what intelligence is, and here it is, you know. It does constitute sort of a rejection of this approach, and I'll be getting to that. So I want to explore a little bit of how feedback, this Wiener's picture of feedback and homeostasis, and how they fit into the broader philosophical picture. On page 41, Wiener refers to Leibniz as a fundamentally dynamic philosopher focused on the interaction of monads rather than portraying a static system like Spinoza does. And I don't think Wiener is unfair, but I think that he may be portraying Leibniz as a bit more Heraclitan than is wholly warranted. Leibniz is not as focused on flux per se as Wiener makes him out to be, but that statement is actually very revealing of Wiener's own concerns, which are that of a very much more dynamic and even enchanted cosmic order. Why enchanted? Because Wiener believes that through his kind of mathematical modeling, we can grasp certain hidden orders to the world that we haven't been able to get to by existing scientific models. These more what he would deem to be more static scientific models, particularly ones that precede thermodynamics, because a lot of what Wiener is doing here is coming out of statistical mechanics, statistical physics, and that being transitioned into information theory. And if you recall the Leibniz reading, we saw how Leibniz portrayed two parallel orders. On the one hand, there were humans creating mechanical apparati that had no true unity. And on the other, there was God creating human apparati that did have true unity. And the second one is what I would deem the enchanted order, because it has some sort of mystical aura around it, no matter how regimented and mechanistic it might be. And Wiener's position is, in effect, that we can get to this second godly enchanted order through cybernetic theory by injecting the study of these cybernetic processes into traditional scientific and engineering disciplines. And the way to do that is, in essence, through the study of signals, because the inputs and outputs we've been talking about are, to Wiener, fundamentally signals. And that is where we get to the parallel that I wanted to draw out, which is with information theory and signal processing. And I said this a bit before we started, but information theory is one of the most misunderstood topics in all of physics and computer science, and a large part of that is it uses two words that are extremely easy to overload with meaning, and those two words are information and entropy. How many of you know Thomas Pynchon's story Entropy? No one's really? No one's read Pynchon's story? And wow, that's amazing.
I have.
Okay, at least someone has. Yeah, Pynchon hates that story, but for a time at least, it was a pretty famous story because it sort of it portrayed, you know, a party, a bunch of people at a party as sort of a Maxwell's demon type entropic principle, and Pynchon made use of entropy and in The Crying of Lot 49 as well, but. He really didn't like, Pynchon really criticizes entropy because he basically says, look, I just tried, I made the story serve the idea, and that was really lame. So he criticizes entropy story for being mechanistic. But oddly, Pynchon still displays more of a grasp of entropy than a lot of people who write about entropy. So there you go. I will say one thing to remember: entropy is not intrinsically related to disorder. There are experts who will disagree with this, but disorder is a human anthropomorphic construct, unless you want to define disorder in a very, very counterintuitive way, and entropy is a statistical principle. Anyway, information and entropy, yeah. So Claude Shannon, when he defined the fundamentals of information theory, made it very clear that there was no semantic concept to the information he was talking about. And this is one of the reasons why he tended to avoid the term information in the first place, and say communication theory, for example. But that's not been the case for most discussions of information theory, and using the term entropy as a measurement of information, or sometimes the term negentropy for negative entropy, has made things much, much worse. The high-level explanation is that information theory is about uncertainty. Information in the technical sense does not exist in a vacuum, but in a context of possibility, and specifically the possible messages that a sender may send to a receiver. So let's say someone mails a letter to me. If I know that the sender is sending an English message, that constrains what possible messages the sender may send. In that, if I say, look at a word, I can at least constrain what words might come next. You're not going to see two ands in a row, for example, not likely anyway. Likewise, English spelling constrains, okay, if you see a letter, then you have certain probabilities as to what comes next. But it's always within a context of what possibilities exist. The measurement to what degree of uncertainty exists is the foundation of information theory. If there's no uncertainty around what message is going to be sent, if there's only one possible message that can be sent, then one can say that the system has no information whatsoever. The information content of the system is zero, because no uncertainty can be resolved by sending a message, since no uncertainty existed in the first place. The receiver knows what the message is going to be before the message is even sent. Here, another example, a two-sided coin. It has one bit of uncertainty, a bit being the measure, the primary measure here of information. You flip the coin, you get one of two possible messages or results, heads or tails. And that one bit of information is the information of the system. If the coin has heads on both sides, then there is no information on the system because there is no uncertainty as to what you will get. The information content of the system is zero.
Another question before we continue. The context of uncertainty and possibilities. I really don't know anything about. Was it possibility theory or probability theory? Probability theory. Is it necessary that there is a total set of possibilities for information theory, or is it also like because a set is always a totality and not an irreducible reality, and like this?
Yes,
yeah, is it dependent upon this idea of because as far as I know, probability theory relies on a set of possibilities.
Yeah,
And
as does information theory. You must know the set of possibilities. You may not be able to enumerate them, but you must know their size. I guess they must be conceivably innumerable. Yeah, that
at least in principle, totalizable, and yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and I mean, and this is
that's
something that comes up in, I mean, so many arguments about probability boil down to, do you actually, application of probability is actually, do you actually know what, what set of possibilities you're drawing from? And this is when you have people talking about the anthropic principle of, well, the chances of, life existing, whatever, are so low that that the universe must have been fine-tuned or something. And the response is, wait, how are you assessing the ensemble of possibilities here? How are you drawing out that, okay, well, this is one versus the other? And this comes up metaphysically when you get to quantum theory, because when you have things like multiple worlds, it's like, okay, well, wait, if the world splits every time there's a quantum gap, why am I in this world? How does probability even work then? Because no probability is actually being chosen. Everything is resulting. So if all metaphysical possibilities always exist, then what does probability even mean? You have to have some moment of selection, and that's the thing that Everett's many worlds hypothesis always runs into. So actually, any other questions about information theory before I elaborate on it in the context of cybernetics? There's a great book, probably by I think his name John Pierce, I think. An Introduction to Information Theory: Symbols, Signals, and Noise. It's very no nonsense. If you're curious, it's well worth a read, just to give your brain a workout. So information theory turns out to be extremely useful in measuring redundancy in transmissions of signals, and putting theoretical limits on the possible amount of uncertainty a message it can resolve, and also dealing with the issue of corruption. That is, how much corruption can a signal endure while still being able to communicate whatever resolution of uncertainty it was meant to create. And this is where the entire field of error correction comes from, because information theory can provide all sorts of constraints and models for okay, this is exactly how much you can get away with in terms of redundancy and error correction. So CDs have tons of bits on them that are compact discs that are devoted to, and DVDs that are devoted to basically error correction if the player either misreads or can't read one particular bit. And that's classic application of information theory. But information theory also turns out to have bizarre implications across all of physics, including black holes and quantum theory, and places where you think that information has no business in being. And that's one of the reasons why you have these somewhat far-fetched theories that speculate that information is more fundamental than energy or matter or whatever else, because even in quantum theory, when locality breaks down and you seem to have what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, when two entangled particles seem to instantaneously affect one another despite being arbitrarily far away from each other, even when the basic laws of physics seem to make no sense, information theory still holds. And this is why information has come to be seen by some people as more fundamental than any sort of classical physics, because it's one of the few areas of physics left standing after quantum physics gets through with it. And Wiener himself was drawn to this line of argument. On page 132, he says, information is information, not matter or energy. No materialism which does not admit this can survive at the present day. The problem being, as I hinted, is that information is a statistical concept rather than an explicitly ontological one. And so when people start saying that information is fundamental, it is like saying that energy is fundamental or mass is fundamental rather than saying that atoms are fundamental. It's a very fungible term by its very nature. And so when Wiener makes information fundamental, he's effectively saying that his information-based model for organisms is better for reality is better than other models based on energy or matter. And specifically, it's better for modeling decision-making processes and evolutionary processes of complex systems, and in particular, those that demonstrate nonlinear mathematical dynamics. But he isn't quite going far enough to say what the ontological nature of information actually is, only that it cannot be reduced to some older physical concept. And that in turn gives rise to the shut up and calculate mantra, which was coined by the information theoretical quantum physicist David Merman. And shut up and calculate is what physicists say to philosophers and philosophically minded physicists who want to know the ontological status of all these concepts that are being thrown around. They say, just do the math, get the results, you're not going to know anymore. And I think that ultimately cybernetics does take a similar view of information, not in the sense of putting it at the core of physics, but in the sense of it being the fundamental constraining factor on the world. Because cybernetics, which is the science of control and communication, can also be thought of as a science of possibility. That is, organism exists in an environment, cybernetics states that the organism's fundamental task is to cope with a variety of possibilities, only one of which will actually come about. And this is at the beginning of Ashby's book on page 5, when he says, cybernetics envisages a set of possibilities much wider than the actual, and then asks why the particular case should conform to its usual particular restriction. Even whether the system is closed to energy or open is often irrelevant. What is important is the extent to which the system is subject to determining and controlling factors. And what science deals with, what science deals with the selection of one reality from an ensemble of possibilities and what constraints can be put on that situation? It's information theory. And here's the cybernetic analogy, which I'm not sure is explicitly stated anywhere, which is that the environment is the sender, the organism is the receiver. The organism has an idea of the possible messages or sensory inputs which the environment can give it. It must anticipate and model possible responses to the various possible messages. And then when the organism receives an actual message from its environment, it must respond in a meaningful way by selecting some responsive message from the organism's own set of possibilities. And these messages can also be termed signals. Ashby in particular wants to take this even further and put the idea of selection from an ensemble at the very center of intelligence. I don't know that the other cyberneticians went quite so far. He says, now, problem solving is largely perhaps entirely, this is at the very end, problem solving is largely perhaps entirely a matter of appropriate selection. Take, for instance, any popular book of problems and puzzles. Almost everyone can be reduced to the form out of a certain set, indicate one element. It is, in fact, difficult to think of a problem, either playful or serious, that does not ultimately require an appropriate selection as necessary and sufficient for its solution. It is also clear that many of the tests used for measuring intelligence are scored essentially according to the candidate's power of appropriate selection. Thus, one test shows the child a common object and asks its name. Out of all words, the child must select the proper one. Another test asks the child how it would find a ball in the field. Out of all the possible paths, the child must select one of the suitable few. Thus, it is not impossible that what is commonly referred to as intellectual power may be equivalent to power of appropriate selection. Indeed, if a talking black box were to show high power of appropriate selection in such matters, so that when given difficult problems it persistently gave correct answers, we could hardly deny that it was showing the behavioral equivalent of high intelligence. If this is so, and we know that the power of selection can be amplified, it seems to follow that intellectual power, like physical power, can be amplified. And this is somewhat extreme because Ashby wants to reduce intelligence, broadly speaking, to a matter of selection. Trivially speaking, this is true. The right answer or answers to a problem are always a subset of all possible answers to a problem. A really good work of music is a subset of all possible works of music, most of them awful. But you quickly run up against the problem that was memorably portrayed in Borges' story, The Library of Babel. And do you know this story? Well, no Borges fans? Really? Wow. Okay, everybody should read Borges.
Wait, what about Hernan?
Sorry?
Hernan, you read Borges, right?
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so some people have read Borges. So yeah, he has this story called The Library of Babel. And he describes a library containing every possible book with every possible sequence of letters in it. Every masterpiece and every piece of knowledge in the universe is in the library. The problem is you can't locate any of it. You can't even locate the index to find the book you're looking for, which is because the index itself is a book and you can't find it. So in reducing problem solving to selection, Ashby somewhat elides the issue that selection is not necessarily a homogeneous or brute force operation. Obviously, the cybernetics would like it to be, would like to capture what exactly is involved in selection, but it's possible, but I want to suggest that selection here has been inflated to the size of a term like intelligence. That in other words, it is not that he has defined intelligence down, but he has defined selection up. Now, does demonstrating selection at the level of a human being designate intelligence? Yes, but it's not necessarily clear that this kind of selection is the sort of selection which Ashby claims cybernetics can amplify. But there is a very interesting anticipatory echo of the motif we will see once we can enter the computer age properly, which is that applying sheer computational force to complicated problems actually can yield more intelligent behavior, even if the underlying algorithms and data representations aren't any more sophisticated. I'm sure that this is not what Ashby had in mind, but it's pretty interesting nonetheless. Thank you, Jamie, because we return to this theme of, can you get more intelligence from our perspective without actually doing operations that are designed to the end of capturing intelligence in a non-black box way. Ashby, of course, concerned with the black box, who does think of things as a black box, is like, yeah, of course, you know, once it behaves intelligently, that's it. The problem is even more fundamental because an organism is not absorbing the world all around it in all its splendor. Rather, its sensory modalities, whether touch, sight, or hearing, are only parsing certain facets of the environment, and the signals which are understood and then passed on to the nervous system and the brain, those signals themselves are constrained in their possibilities by the sensory modalities that are apprehending them. So information theory enters the picture not just in terms of what signals the organism considers possible, but in terms of the biological or physical limitations on what kinds of systems it is possible for an organism to glean from its environment through its sensory modalities in the first place. And all of this, Wiener says, falls under information theory and that which can be modeled by information. So given this setup where an organism receives one of many possible messages or signals, how then does it choose what response to make, what signal to issue in response in order to fulfill whatever goals that it might have, homeostasis, for example? To the extent that the black boxes of cybernetics think, this is the step where it happens. An organism has to have some ways of vaguely anticipating what might happen, even implicitly, so that it can respond appropriately. So the question then is, how on earth does an organism constrain and model the possibilities for the message it might receive? To take a step back, if we are to build an artificial intelligence, how do we create such a model for our AI? And that is the essence of cybernetics. And the solution, more or less, because much of this criticism of cybernetics will be to say you don't actually have a solution to this problem. The solution could be said to be pattern recognition. Again, if you recall the Breitenberg reading from the first week, many of his machines were, in essence, homeostatic robots directed towards one goal or another. And as they got more sophisticated, Breitenberg began to speak of vehicles that could abstract over sets of inputs over time and construct what might be called ideas around these sets of inputs based on identifying similarities across these different scenarios and abstracting away from the differences. This is a very Kantian and as well as a Peircean move. You're taking fairly raw experience through sensory modalities and generating, or in the Peircean term, prescinding, categories from those experiences by isolating, unifying characteristics and tossing away that which doesn't fit. The danger is that what you toss away is actually more important than you thought, and that what you've unified is in fact less helpful than some other abstraction. But that is the process at work in simply learning how to think. And that is where Peirce's error comes from as well. The idea that if you get the wrong abstractions, you find that out when they fail to work effectively in the world. Or from a cybernetics viewpoint, when they fail to generate correct homeostatic behavior or correct coping behavior, which is the same thing, failing to work effectively in the world. It can be seen as a pragmatic argument or pragmatic criterion. So to bring the pieces together, cybernetics poses a model for artificial intelligence that at once solves and evades certain problems. It's almost a rejoinder to Turing's question, can a machine think? Before Turing even, and the reason I say that is that for the cyberneticians, thinking is to be cashed out in very functional black box terms. But in doing so, it dissolves the problem that Turing was trying to address. For Turing, by posing the question of whether machines think and suggesting a replacement of that question with a socially contextual and behavioral question of can a machine convince a human that it is a human, Turing is implicitly endorsing the original form of the question and then simply saying that question is a problem. Ironically, by sidelining that question, Wiener and the cyberneticians actually make a more radical move than Turing. Turing says, for thinking, read X, where X is success at the imitation game. For Turing, it is an important question, but it needs to be reformulated before it can be answered. Wiener implicitly says, thinking happens on top of this ecosystem of organisms, and so your question isn't even important. Look at homeostasis and signals, Wiener says, and that will be a far more important investigation than any of this thinking you might be referring to. Thinking serves adaptation and coping, not the other way around. And so cybernetics deprivileges subjectivity in the human in a far more radical way than Turing or the symbolic AI folks. So I think from the archaeological standpoint, I think that cybernetics is in many ways a quintessentially modernist project. By modernist, I mean one addressing the notion of large-scale and primarily urban growth and an increasing notion of people not in one-to-one individual relations, but in archetypal replicated relations. This is not something to be taken for granted, because in symbolic AI, we move back to a far more particularist model in which individual entities can be easily distinguished. But the achievement of cybernetics, in my opinion, is to frame intelligence in terms of something that is primarily non-semantic, which is information. And it's ironic to think of something called information as non-semantic, but in the technical Shannon sense and the sense in which Wiener and Ashby invoke it, it is a statistical measure to which semantics are irrelevant, at least in the fundamental sense. Now, I don't think any of the cyberneticians pretended that semantics did not have to enter the picture at some point, but if you look at the readings, they all seem to wish that semantics remains within the black boxes about which they're speaking, which is to say that they want the semantics, or you could say thoughts, that relate to a particular situation to be abstractable from the concrete relations and cybernetic models of that environment and organisms. They want the concrete relations, in the phrasing of McCulloch and Pitts, to be multiply realizable through the workings of a black box. A variety of semantics could be used. This is, again, a functionalist perspective, but it's one that draws the line in almost a quasi-behavioral way. I say quasi-behavioral because someone like Breitenberg has no trouble suggesting that the inner workings of some sort of homeostatic organism must give consideration to its environment in one or another particular ways. It's just that these models and representations and identifications of patterns are still quite gold-optional in their orientation. As long as you get to where you're going, the path you take isn't as important. The particular semantic sense you make in the world is not especially important. And by extension, even the particular semantic relations in between organisms are not particularly important as much as their pragmatic applications and practices. Though the texts we've been reading don't stress this point, the comparative lack of emphasis placed on language in the cybernetic writings is reflective of, I believe, a desire to diminish the significance of language so that it too is just another sequence of inputs and outputs. Like thinking itself, the semantics of language are something that for the cyberneticians is posterior to the fundamental work of processing signals, identifying patterns, and maintaining homeostasis. And that is, in a sense, where I'd like to leave off with the main work of cybernetics. We're going to certainly harken back to it a lot, but I think that's sort of the conclusion that I wanted to get to there. So I wanted to take a break here and ask for questions, comments, thoughts on cybernetics.
I have sort of a general question, David. I feel like it's not clear, but like fairly, I like know where to look, I guess, in the, like in considering like what's going on with sort of temporality, and like we already sort of have some names like Bergson and sort of like this T+1 idea and about feedback and et cetera, et cetera. But like my question is sort of what's going on with space in this context. And I know that there's that quote by Wiener, I think, or maybe it's McCullough in that same reading where he says, space and time are basically just interesting for their utility or something like this. Space indefinite as to space, indefinite as to time. I can't remember. I could find the exact quote, but I know it's an interesting quote, and I know that there are a couple of authors, particularly this author Reed Halpern, sort of actually refrains that quote in her text on Beautiful Data 3 times.
Who?
Reed Halpern. I'll send it. But and I think that she may be
so weird. My friend just gave me a copy of that book yesterday. That's so uncanny.
It's really good.
So bizarre.
It's very, very good.
What are the chances? No, I literally just got this yesterday. That's so funny.
Well, it was assigned to me in a class on cybernetics that I took last year or so. But like, I guess I think that Halpern like provides a pretty interesting way of sort of like delving into the question of space, because she's focused on things like smart cities and sort of urban design and the sort of group of cybernetic influenced designers like Kepps and Fuller and all these folks. And then she also sort of is thinking about sort of sculptors actually. But like more specifically, I just want to ask, particularly with what Eric was saying, about something like sets are not irreducible pluralities, but they're actually sort of conceivable sort of totalities or something. That's actually sort of mind-blowing for me. And like, I'm wondering if like a probability, and I didn't get all of what your exchange with Eric was in this regard, but like the probability responds to a sort of like in principle enumerability of a given set or something like this.
Yeah, one could say.
Does that make sense? Like, like that sounds like some sort of set of relations that is in principle enumerable or something. And like the only language I have to think about that in a way is sort of like a topological approach. But like, is that like, I don't understand if this is reducible to just spatial relations. And I'm not asking you if topology is just a spatial idea, but I'm asking in the context of like information.
No, I think it gets back to what Wiener was saying, in that he wants to say it's more fundamental than that. It is a statistical process, so it does not necessarily need to be spatial. It can be anything. It's neutral ontologically. As long as you can enumerate possibilities, it doesn't matter what they are. The way statistical physics evolved, it started off as being primarily spatial, because you were dealing with thermodynamics and Boltzmann's entropy. So you're effectively looking at, okay, well, here you've got a bunch of microstates of particles in various places, and at the macro state, what you want is to lump, like, let's say you've got let's say I've got a glass that's half water and half oil. Well, there's the state in which they're completely separate, and then there's all these other states in which they're mixed. So on the macro state, I've got, on a few states, I've got a comparatively small number of states of them being unmixed. Actually, oil and water don't mix, so forget that. Okay, how about water and orange juice? You've got a comparatively small number of states in which we would say that they are not mixed, and a huge number of states in which we would say they are mixed. And so from that, we can obtain what's the probability of it being unmixed. Well, we take the two sets of states, of microstates that we have, and just figure out what the percentage is, and that gives us our probability. There are people who disagree with this, but so you have those spatial applications, but information theory, you get to the point where you're now applying the same principles and the same mathematics, probabilistic mathematics, in context where there's no spatiality whatsoever. And arguably not, I mean, not necessarily temporality either, only to the extent that you have the sequence of, okay, well, there's possibility and it can be resolved. But that's not necessarily temporal intrinsically, because information theory can model the static situation, can model the situation at a given point in time. Does that make sense, or is there follow up? I'm happy to talk more about this. It's a difficult topic.
Yeah, it's confusing. I mean, I guess my last question is like how, and maybe this isn't sort of an aim that you have, but sort of, I know we've been talking a little bit about like transcendental, like Kant, and I'm wondering if in this case, like, is there a sort of, well, maybe I'm just forgetting what you were speaking about last week in the context of cybernetics and sort of the Kantian critique, I guess. But what was it? You were saying something about the transcendent as like a as some sort of frame for these sorts of discussions. But if like you can't remember what
the necessary conditions for the possibility of thought, or?
Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to like wrap my head around what that would do with this idea of sort of utility or usefulness, I guess. It's a vague question. If nothing comes, how that fits, then we can move on.
I think that perhaps I think it becomes a tool in that process, in that as an organism begins to work with managing these cybernetically defined processes of selection and anticipating possibilities, you start to generate like I said, you start to generate the sort of abstractions and patterns that could be said not just to be abstractions in a Humean sense, but can become full-blown categories. Kant would not say that, because maybe he would. Forget it. I'm not gonna. But Peirce would certainly say, yes, you're building up these categories by messing up, and one of the ways you're messing up is maybe you model the possibility space wrong. You didn't think that could happen. I don't mean space. You know what I mean? A space in the figurative sense. Mm-hmm. So the conditions don't become the conditions remain a bit of a black box, in that yes, the organism has to be capable of doing this, but the cyberneticians always sort of shoo away the problem of, okay, well, how are you going to do this? And in some ways, that is exactly what Minsky and the other symbolic AI people attack cybernetics for, is by saying you've dodged this question for too long, and it's not useful.
Okay, thank you.
David, I have a question.
Yeah.
So under this cybernetic premise, an organism that can optimize its levels of abstraction to capture certain patterns without losing meaningful information, understood as a correct prediction of a circumstance or survival, if you will, would be the most efficient organism, right? As it's not using unnecessarily high resolution on a problem that doesn't merit it. But my question is, do you think that the modulation of a level of abstraction applied to distinct problems would qualify as a marker of intelligence?
What? To whom?
No, to you. Or do in the cybernetic, or maybe looking at through
because I think the cybernetic inclination is to say, if you think it does, the cybernetic inclination is to say, that, intelligence is posterior towards this behavior. So as you build it up, you're going to get things that by our conventional definition, clearly qualify as intelligence. Any modulation of such doesn't necessarily have to be intelligence, but I think the cyberneticians want to remain agnostic and say that intelligence is one of these things that it is in the eye of the beholder, unlike homeostasis. And so markers of intelligence is old-fashioned, and we need to see this in the modern way.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Let me see. Maybe I'll do the. Okay, so
maybe, I don't know if my question is maybe a bit too complex. Or do we have, because I wanted to ask, as far as I know, everything we talked about was about first order cybernetics.
Yes.
Maybe, I don't know if it's too complex to go into this, but maybe like what the key differences are between first and second order cybernetics, and maybe what the way was to come to second order I don't know if that's too complex.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, from my perspective, it's a bit, cybernetics becomes very diasporic. Like the MIT group falls apart in 1952 because, and a lot of people, basically Norbert Wiener has some mysterious falling out with them, especially with McCulloch. And the reason that's frequently given for this is that Wiener's wife thought McCulloch was a dirty hippie and insisted that Wiener get away from him. I don't know if that's true, but for whatever reason, Wiener basically like split off, and Wiener was the strongest personality, and I think the most the one who was really pushing things forward. And so like that heart of cybernetics sort of disintegrates at that point. And McCulloch and Wiener die, I think, within the next 10 years. And Pitts, who is probably like the smartest one of the batch, is an alcoholic and becomes even more of an alcoholic. And I think he starts refusing to sign his name or something. I don't know. And so cybernetics sort of spreads out into a variety of very, very different contexts, most of them not related directly to computer science. You have Stafford Beer is one of the biggest names here. And I take it you're thinking of him and for one?
I'm thinking specifically about, because that's maybe the most, the person I know, Heinz von Förster.
Oh, yep. Heinz von Förster is another one too. Yes, Förster, Stafford Beer, Humberto Maturana. All these people take these ideas, and many of them are taking them in different directions. And I think that this is why second order cybernetics is a bit harder to capture, because you have Stafford Beer with his management theory. You have Heinz von Förster with, what is von Förster's, what's the term he uses? I mean, he wrote a book called like the Cybernetics of Cybernetics, but that's not very useful. So what was his big term?
I think it's about observer of the second order
Maybe he didn't have, but I and Margaret Mead's involved in it too, I think, a little bit. But I mean, if you look at the distinction between like Maturana and von Förster and whatever, it's going in. they're sort of taking these things, but they're almost going in, I don't know, it's like post-Hegelian philosophy or something, that they're sort of using, that it becomes more increasingly metaphorical, perhaps. I don't know. But it divorces itself from, I would say that it divorces itself from the engineering focus that was, you know, that you don't see a figure like von Neumann emerging in this. So I look at it very much as a sociological movement in which you're seeing these diasporic forces create little enclaves of more research-oriented tasks, and as a consequence of that, they read differently than Ashby or Walter or Wiener. So it's difficult for me to sum up. I don't know. What do you think, Hernan?
I wanted to talk about a little bit about Walter Gray.
Uh-huh.
That we didn't about the autonomization of like
Gray Walter, actually.
Gray Walter, right.
I know.
And I found it very, very well written and very clear.
Yeah, that was why I wanted to give it as an introduction, simply because the Wiener book is especially all over the place, and Ashby is a bit more arcane as well. And I felt that Walter probably did the best job of, I think, giving a feel for it, even if he is a bit, even if he sort of comes after people chronologically.
Yeah, that was actually it. Like the metaphor he uses is I think brilliant. About you need a quiet environment somewhere so as to be able to feel the perturbations of the patterns and signals. It's very poetic and beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean precisely that you know, and Walter was known, became sort of, he had a splash because he built these little automata. He built these little like robotic turtles. Yeah, and there are pictures of them, and you can see them, and it's like, yeah, it made a big splash. It's just that the sort of analog robotic approach was something to the cyberneticians, and I think people like von Forster and Stafford Beer moved away from automata per se, and wanted to apply it more to societal problems. And that, you know, and that's why Margaret Mead gets involved, is, you know, she wants to look at it as, okay, well, yeah, we have these modernist problems of analyzing human behavior at large scale. What do we what methods can we bring to bear on them? And I think second order cybernetics takes that aspect of Wiener's work in particular and moves away from McCulloch and Pitts and Ashby towards and they're focused on microprocesses, on the brain, on individual homeostats.
Yeah, and also von Neumann's kind of implicitly, this is something I found interesting as well. The analog digital distinction. He goes into like an ontological discussion with himself without even realizing it. I believe, I don't know, maybe he realized it, but anyway, and he stops at a certain level, but that can go indefinitely. And it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, God, I mean, there could be a whole course on the analog digital distinction, and you'll see that Minsky goes after analog really hard, and in some ways that's because, well, there was very clear progress on digital circuits and digital processing capacity, and so, you know, there's blatant progress being made there, whereas analog remains analog mechanisms remain somewhat opaque and more difficult to model, and eventually one can think of those two things as getting synthesized a bit, into the extent that you get with enough digital power, you get, you know, you can effectively start seeing some like deep learning operations as, you know, not analog but good enough, perhaps. I don't know, that you're doing a digital replication. You're doing a process that is digital at the micro level, but might as well be analog on the macro level.
I have this sort of wonderful essay that I've been looking at by Bruce Clark and Mark Hansen. It's the introduction to their book called Emergence. What's the book? Emergence and Embodiment: New Essays on Second-Order Systems Theory.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind if I read this like very quick quote about how they pose the difference between first and second order?
Oh, go for it. Yeah. I'm curious to see what they say. Yeah.
Yeah. It's good. Where is it? Yeah. So one way to mark one way to mark the emergence of new cybernetics, our preferred paraphrase of second-order cybernetics. So one way to mark the emergence of second-order cybernetics is to emphasize its new questioning and eventual overcoming of classical substance/form distinctions. Neo-cybernetic systems theory radicalizes the constructivist epistemology inscribed within the first cybernetics by shifting to an autological rather than ontological theory of form. In neo-cybernetic theory, the form/substance dichotomy is superseded by the distinction between form and medium. And then on the a couple pages later, and I'll link to this, they talk about Heinz von Forster. First-order cybernetics underscored the provisional nature or the constructedness of cognitions within observing systems, but it did so by undercutting the significance and contribution of material/energetic environments to the cognitive systems that emerge within them. The strong constructivism of neo-cybernetic systems theory deals with the world by promoting a new level of attention to the media of its forms, or more concretely, to the environments and the embodiments of systems. And then I'll just read one more sentence. As Bruce Clark's essay demonstrates, we see this ecological convergence of constructivism and cybernetic, quote, environmentalism in the key figure responsible for the turn from first to second order systems theory, Heinz von Forster. At the beginning of his 1974 essay on constructing a reality, von Forster recounted how perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, some of my American friends came running to me with the delight and amazement of having just made a great discovery. I'm living in an environment when we perceive our environment, it is we who invent it.
Wait, sorry, I didn't catch the last half of it. When we perceive our environment.
Yeah, I skipped some things. Yet despite the ecological revelation of their newfound environment, according to von Forster, his friends have yet to make another and even more crucial discovery. When we perceive our environment, it is we who invent it.
We who invent it?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I think, I mean, ironically, in some ways, that can be said to be somewhat analogous to, ironically, one can say that it is in some ways invoking the same criticism that the symbolic AI people are making, which is that you have to place more emphasis on the work being done at that abstraction layer and at the modeling layer within the organism. In other words, once again, getting away from sort of the relaxing the black box assumption a bit, because it's just, you can't solve it just from knowing the inputs and outputs. And I suppose that probably bears on where Searle got the Chinese room argument from as well. Here's an example of, actually I found this image. Is there an easy way to share an image without like sharing my screen?
Maybe share it in the chat.
Let's see if I can do this. It does not like doing that. Okay, let's just share the screen then. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Share. That's good. Okay. Oh, does this work? This might work. Okay. This is Stafford Beer's cybernetic company. And I mean, if you look at it, you can see that again, it's basically they've taken, what Beer's done is he's taken a lot of cybernetic concepts and said, okay, well, what if the company is the organism? And he's even drawn an organism like amoeba shape around it. And the company is responding to the environment. And how can we sort of model, how can we model the workings of a factory or a company such that it can be healthy, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll send the link, I guess. And again, this is what I say. I'm not sure if Beer may not have even identified himself as second order per se. I think he might not have, but I mean, he's just at that general juncture. And I think it's the same approach to the same problem. Okay, well, how do you progress beyond these generalized mathematical models and start applying them to more particular situations? And Beer was the one who got hired by the Allende government to try to apply diagrams like this to Chile, to basically manage Chile's economy cybernetically. And nobody knows what would have happened to it if Pinochet hadn't thrown the coup. There's an amazing picture. Hold on. Let's see if I can find it. Of the supposed control room, of the intended control room for. Here we go. How about this? For Chile's government. Let's see. Is this good? It's. Let's try this. The CyberSyn. I give you the CyberSyn control room. Anyway, if you're curious, look it up. It's just such an amazing story.
Now, was this model, where was it located? Did they actually build this on site in Santiago, or was this built like in New England somewhere?
I think this is in Santiago. I'm not positive. I thought this was built in Santiago. They were prototyping it and putting it in place. Like he was down there, I think.
Okay.
And yeah, there's been a couple books
Yeah,
about it.
MIT Press one.
Yeah. Which one?
I'll do another link. one moment.
Uh,
It's this one.
the Medina
Yes.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the book. Yeah, I mean, it's just it's just something. It just sort of makes your eyes sort of like go wide when you read read about it. Okay. Anyway, so yeah. Uh, it does. The thing is, at this point, I think it has branched the mainstream of AI, and so we're a bit away from the subject of the course, and so I sort of will leave it off there. But it is a very interesting subject, and uh, happy to discuss it further offline. I think we should take a bit of a break now, and after which point I'm going to speak a little about the transition to symbolic AI, and then I think Jesse will have a presentation and Aladdin will have a response. So why don't we give it, have people been okay with a 5-minute break? Do people need a little longer? 5 minutes, okay? All right, let's give it 5 or 6 minutes and I'll see you all shortly. Okay. Whoops. Hello? Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Wow, everything was so quiet. I actually thought the sound had gone out. Okay. Okay. Next paradigm. Okay. The term artificial intelligence proper is coined around 1956 at the Dartmouth conference that I mentioned in the first week of our course, and that conference includes most of these symbolic AI pioneers: John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, Herbert Simon, Alan Newell. These are the names you want to associate with symbolic AI, and they're the names that make up our reading for this subject. Carnap is a bit of prehistory, so but he's very important, and we will get to him probably next week. But in addition, at this Dartmouth conference, you've got Claude Shannon there, although he as well as Ashby and McCulloch, but their contribution isn't really talked about so much. They're already sort of standing aside from it. Wiener, very tellingly, is not there, and John McCarthy, who is at least one of the people who created the term artificial intelligence, posed it as a specific rejection of cybernetics. Here's McCarthy's quote: that he coined the term, coined the term to escape the association with cybernetics. Its concentration on analog feedback seemed misguided, and I wished to avoid having either to accept Norbert Wiener as a guru or having to argue with him. Which, based on accounts of Wiener, seems to be a lot of people's impression of him. So the study of analog systems is out. The focus on large-scale systems and environments is out in favor of smaller problems and microsystems, and the idea of the black box is put into the background in favor of considering the inner workings and particular implementations of what might constitute artificial intelligence. Now, it's not that the cybernetics contributions are forgotten or ignored. In the Minsky paper we read today, which is from 1961, the Steps Towards Artificial Intelligence, you can see cybernetic fingerprints all over it. He makes reference to McCulloch and Pitts's paper. He framed problems in terms of homeostasis and selection from possibilities, and he looks at visual processing problems that Wiener formulated. But many of these cybernetics issues are invoked as in the service of father slaying, and I think that's a good segue to Jesse's presentation. Jesse, would you like to take it over?
Unmute. Okay.
There it goes. Okay.
All right. I'm going to try to do this sharing thing. Oh, shit. Okay. Does that work? Okay. I think. Yes. Okay. Can everybody see it?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay, cool. All right. So, oh, this is really annoying. Hang on. Sorry, I can't really see because of the participant screens. I can't see the stuff that I put on the right side. 1 second. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the paper by Marvin Minsky, the 1961 paper, Steps Toward Artificial Intelligence. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Minsky himself. Mostly, I'm also going to kind of not necessarily go into all the technical detail or the actually precise maths of it. But I'm going to be looking at more kind of sort of the epistemological commitments that we kind of see in this paper, and how we kind of can see how this was kind of agenda setting in a way, and what David has already referred to as father slaying, kind of like exorcising a lot of the cybernetic assumptions that we'd seen earlier. So Minsky, obviously, most of us will heard about him, and a couple of kind of like dates to kind of see what of an influential figure he actually was. So he actually built one of the first neural networks, and the emphasis on build because he actually built it. And then in 1963, so he was at MIT from 1958 as an instructor and professor up until his death in 2016. And in 1963, he formed the MIT project MAC with John McCarthy, so another of the luminaries of symbolic AI. In 1970, he was a co-founder, again with McCarthy, of the MIT AI lab, which would later become the CSAIL lab that's still at MIT today. And in 1985, he became co-founder of the MIT Media Lab, which is probably one of the reasons why he's been in the news recently as well. Actually, he built, so this is just a really brief excursion, he built the SNARC, which was the stochastic neural analog reinforcement calculator. And he built this in 1951. And it's really interesting because it kind of stands in contrast to a lot of the arguments he puts in this paper, he puts forward in this paper. But I'm going to come back to that later. It's just an interesting note. So on the left, you can actually see this is one neuron that he built for his thing. Yeah, there were thousands of connections, which of course by now is not exactly a large number. But that's one of the reasons why he was also concerned with kind of putting some things to rest, which I'm going to come to. So in this article, he wrote this for the proceedings of the Institute of Radio Engineers in 1961, and he was asked by the editors to write this paper. It's kind of like an overview of the state of things and what kind of endeavors were underway to go towards artificial intelligence. And you can kind of already see from the pages that I picked, there is kind of a larger argument at play here between two approaches. And there's, especially if we want to understand what he's talking about, there's two important statements at the end of the paper that are kind of important to understand his argument, which is first, quote, "Should we ask what intelligence really is? My own view is that this is more of an aesthetic question or one of sense of dignity than a technical matter. To me, intelligence seems to denote little more than the complex of performances which we happen to respect but do not understand." And that's on page 27. And the second one is on page 28, quote, "If a creature can answer a question about a hypothetical experiment without actually performing the experiment, then the answer must have been obtained from some submachine inside the creature," end quote. So these are two kind of like statements of belief that really kind of help to understand what he's talking about. So he's very, very much interested in the exact how, as David was saying earlier, of the kind of submachines. And in a sense, he's also kind of echoing, which is one of the traces that David mentioned, I assume, the notion of an organism by framing it as a creature, but this just as an aside. So he starts by saying there's 5 fundamental areas of problem solving, which is interesting because that's basically what he defines his AI endeavor as. So similar to what Ashby said about the power of appropriate selection as kind of being a notion of intelligence, here we have specifically the notion of problem solving and above all search. And I kind of put that above all because he is basically interested how to make heuristic programs, so problem solving programs, that's what he calls it. And to him, that's mostly a searching endeavor, so as to searching the best solution to a problem. And he sees there are, in general, these larger issues at stake, but most of them kind of are mostly there to make search more efficient and search specifically for a solution. Though induction is a special case, and I will talk about this later. But we can see from these two images that there's kind of like a span that he opens here, which is he does acknowledge, as David said, quite a lot of the work of McCulloch and Pitts and others that are seeing, for example, maybe we could say intelligence, or at least intelligent behavior, as learning from stochastically weighted inference, or on the very other hand, intelligent as transferable functions. So functions that can be translated or transferred to similar problems or problem solution distances. So I'm not going to, in the interest of time, get into everything here, but for example, he starts with one example of finding a solution from a search space, which is to employ hill climbing. And one of the problems that we can see, no, you can't see my mouse, my pointer. Okay, so one problem that we have by trying to invoke hill climbing algorithms, which is actually something that's very much still used today, and there's many variants of that, is that we might hit local plateaus. So we can see this shoulder. So in hill climbing, you want to look for the maximum, but you don't want to end up on a shoulder, because then in your search space, you're not going to progress towards the solution that you're looking for. And the bulk of the paper then, this is a sort of contemporary example, so that's not actually what he's talking about in the paper, is what we need is pattern recognition. So he devotes the bulk of the paper to this. And this is an image from Jan LeCun's, I have no idea how to pronounce it properly, LeNet, maybe, though that sounds like meme speak or something. But it's a very cool page. You should definitely check it out. It's a convolutional neural network. But what should we be looking for? So we should be looking for categories, classes, and we should look for properties that define them. So here he brings in this notion of character. So we want to be able to discern characters or classes. And one of the ways we can do this is normalize input, and we need to do this. And he sets this up quite early to make the argument that is quite relevant here. Because if we're looking for classes or types of solutions or categories or whatever, we want to find out what are the invariant properties of these patterns. So we want to find out what are the classes, like what makes them, what are the invariant properties of them. But a big challenge for this is to do this for, as you would say, for problems that are interesting. So for problems where the search space for solutions is quite large and has potentially a lot of variables in play. So he goes into one way of doing this, and it makes a lot of sense that he does this first. He discusses McCulloch-Pitt's recommendations, and he specifically discusses a proposal of two-layer Bayes nets as proposed by Rosenblatt, which are somewhat similar to what we would recognize as a neural network now. And he also notes something that kind of resembles what we might even talk about as backward propagation, which obviously is not the same as the, or would not take the same shape as it would later. But the interesting thing is that once he starts discussing these Bayes nets, he notes quite quickly, and this is on page 15, but these nets with their simple randomly generated connections can probably never achieve recognition of such patterns as the class of figures having two separated parts, and they cannot even achieve the effect of template recognition without size and position normalization unless figures have been presented previously in essentially all sizes and positions, end quote. So he has this notion that he brings forwards that basically a non-symbolic or a non-fully declarative representative approach to patterning would bring. He has this distrust of it. And of course, on the one hand, that's related to the economic cost at the time, because he notes that there is no way that we can do more than two layers of this fully connected network, because it's just not feasible to run through all the options and paths of connections in order to find a solution. So we have these kind of economic costs, but also you can kind of feel an inkling there that what he's really interested in is the issue, and he says this quite a lot earlier in the paper, what he's interested in is these teleological definitions. So to him, a problem needs to be quite clearly defined, and not just in the terms of what the end goal is, but also how we start and how we proceed. So like very, very different perspective. And the interesting quote here is that, quote, "The real difficulty with teleological definitions is technical, not philosophical, and arises when they have to be used and not just mentioned." So this is kind of like a little dig at when you actually have a problem, then it needs to be implementable and it needs to be realizable technically. So he goes on to say that, quote on page 16, "What is required is clearly a list of whatever length is necessary of the primitive objects in the scene and a statement about the relations among them," end quote. So there's this notion that there has to be, that we know what to look for and where, and that we have to have this list of characters, patterns, figures in an environment, and we need to also know what the relations are among them. So if we then go on, you can kind of already see from the way it's presented that he takes up this notion from the a symbolic functional approach to techniques for figuring out these relations and between clearly described objects. And he directly takes this from Newell, Shaw, and Simon, and he calls this articulation and attention. So that you have formal descriptions of objects and their relations, which you could then theoretically transfer to other states of the environment if the relations hold. So by manipulation of formal descriptions, you attain behavior that you could say is intelligent. And just briefly show this as an example. So one, and I really, really love this example. I love this project. This is kind of system where his money is at that point, or also later. So this is a micro worlds program, which was programmed by Terry Winograd, who was his PhD student. And he programmed it from the late 60s to the early 70s. And you can see that we have a representation of a world, a slightly 2.5D representation of a world with a bunch of geometric objects. And the kind of amazing thing about it back then, and also one of the reasons why programs like this and many others that are very, very similar to it, is that you could actually, per a teletype, which you can see in the bottom, which is what the young man is working on, send inputs into this machine or robot, as Winograd called it. And it would, for example, on the top left, we have a question that was received by the robot. "Will you please stack up both of the red blocks in either a green cube or a pyramid?" And we'd have the robot arm that would pick up the appropriate object and maneuver it somewhere, and then say, "Okay," or "I'm done." And it could reply to things that it didn't understand in the form of "I don't know." And it could say, "You're welcome," when Winograd said, "Thank you." So if we look at a page from Winograd's PhD thesis, we can kind of really see, and obviously this is kind of like a plain text representation. And interestingly, it was implemented in Lisp, which was invented by his colleague, John McCarthy, so Minsky's colleague. So what we can kind of see here is that the idea of this program, and many programs like it, is that it has a fully defined notion of its finite world that is fully integrated with the operation of the program that receives input and generates output and has an action in between. So all of this is very, 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 very tightly coupled. And the idea was then that this kind of approach would be transferable to much more complex problems down the line. Also, David, please note if I'm going ahead too long, then please let me know. Okay.
That's cool.
All right, awesome. Okay, so in the next section of the paper, he talks about reinforcement learning, and especially brings up as a great example the work by Arthur Samuel, who wrote about some studies in machine learning using the game of checkers, which is an interesting example because Shannon also used this as a game theoretically kind of like approach. And the interesting thing is, to some extent, he had this excursion into the symbolic, and now he gets into the issue of learning. And essentially, his argument is very, very similar to the one he brought up against the Bayes nets, or the idea of having more layers of a Bayes net. So even though we have a tree that we could kind of like traverse, he's very much of a mind to say that the trees need to be desperately pruned through reinforcement of coefficient optimization, in a sense, is what's happening in this checkers example. So what we have here obviously is kind of like traveling along possible solution paths, but they need to be to some extent either pruned away or reinforced by a trainer, because otherwise, and that's his word, this pruning must happen because the tree in checkers, but also in any sufficiently complex problem, would just simply be too colossal. So it's a very similar cost-based argument. So one thing that also struck me was when he gets to the notion of credit, the problem of credit really is, in a sense, a notion of, okay, how, if we have all these possible paths towards our problem, how would we even know how the path would work? But I'm just gonna skip this one. Or how would we rather reinforce the wrong paths without essentially diluting the functionality of how to get there? So in the next section, he basically, I'm kind of going to gloss over this one, but maybe we can talk about this more closely. The next question is basically immediately linked to his notion of, okay, so how can we actually think about rules? How can we think about problem solving and planning in a way that kind of is able to deal more clearly with problems? And one of his ways to say, okay, we need to use algebra with recursion, more or less. So again, he refers to Lisp, the programming language, and basically lays out a couple of pseudo programs over these pages, and in which you'd find conditionals and operators and loops, kind of things that we're used to now, and basically also addresses his idea that the value in this entire approach is that the solution to the simpler problem can then be used as a plan for the harder one. So this is kind of the notion that is advanced here. So if we look back at this argument, we can kind of see that he's worked towards this argument that he arrives at later. So to him, it doesn't really matter what intelligence is. It is more or less what he's really interested in is the how. So what he's interested in is the manipulation of symbols that could be of any language, and to understand whether we would get at functions of intelligence as we understand it. So and he also briefly goes into inductive inference, which he kind of sees as dependent on a fully functional internal model of the world or the environment, though he does say with the caveat of using this as a heuristics. And he closes out his paper with one notion that I think is quite interesting. So he says that, as this is, quote, as this is written, we are at last beginning to see vigorous activity in the direction of constructing usable time-sharing or multi-programming computing systems. With these systems, it will at last become economical to match human beings in real time with really large machines, end quote. So kind of the way he brought his argument forward and the way he kind of like outlined this is that eventually he believes that this kind of deductive approach will be programmed to be so integrative and kind of like elemental that you have these complete rule-governed mental models that you can embed in machines that would kind of be able to then become, in a sense, he uses this term, I think it's in the end as well, but that in a sense, machines will think and will be thinking aids to humans. And I'm just going to briefly get into some of the interesting things I think specifically about this paper. So here we see him on the right in a very nicely defined world. So these blockwork worlds, also the Schrödl program is a very, very typical example of a lot of ideas of how intelligence would be studied in symbolic AI. So there are some extreme notions in this paper, even though it presents a wide range of what was kind of the state of the art back then. But what this paper effectively does in arguing against the approach of the Bayes-Nets or Rosenblatt's approach in particular is discourage ANN, so artificial neural network development, and kind of set up the paradigm for symbolic AI. So particularly in conjunction with a book called kind of misleadingly Perceptrons, which he authored with Papert in 1969, is seen by some as being directly responsible for the withering away of AI research in the 1970s and the associated first AI winter. So you can already see his arguments at work in this paper here from 1961. And if we look, there we got him again. So if we look, there's a sociology paper on this book in particular. So if we look at a quote from the author, quote, "The proofs and arguments of Minsky and Papert, which were interpreted as showing that further progress in neural nets was not possible, and this approach to AI had to be abandoned. I maintain that this official interpretation of the debate was a result of the emergence, institutionalization, and importantly, legitimation of the symbolic AI approach with its resource allocation system and authority structure." So you kind of get a hint, and also one of the hints is that the MIT and a lot of the undertakings in this kind of symbolic AI approach were heavily funded by DARPA, which obviously kind of gives you a notion of why resource allocation and authority structure is also kind of desirable. And we had this in the last session, I think. One notion that I think is also interesting, though, I mean, this is a bit more prosaic, I guess, that you have this notion that he has of a very kind of like Cartesian agent who contains their environment, and you have this entirely agent-imaged environment that you cannot really assume to think that there may actually be counterfactuals hidden in the environment that would kind of stand into, or rules in the environment, or possible other orders in the environment that might actually stand in contrast to the a priori of the entirely constructed environment notion of the author, of the engineer or agent or whatever. So his colleague, I forget who it was, it might have been McCarthy. You can kind of see this as a contrast between constructionism and constructivism, which is okay in a sense, because obviously this is quite a long time ago. And he also acknowledges in the end, in the sense of right now, this is the best idea of intelligence and consciousness that we have at the moment. And on another notion, which I thought was interesting with regard to some of my recent reading, is also that what's curious to me is that he spends a lot of time talking about recursion as being really, really important, so as an essential kind of like technical operational necessity. But what he kind of cannot obviously foresee is the ways in which all these machines that he outlines, especially neural networks, which obviously are quite widespread and influential now, is that he does not kind of foresee that there will be a recursion of all these machines into continua and variations of problem solution distances or intelligent behavior, or just altering ways in which we think about intelligence in the first place, that will come about. So in the end, in relation to something that he said in the start, one of the fear of AI being the revelation of truths too terrible to be born. I'll show you my last title slide, which was my initial sketch, and the presentation here. So, thank you.
Thank you for that, Jesse. I believe Aladdin had a response to it as well.
Yes, sure. I mean, yeah, I will also share my screen quickly. So it's more like a broad idea that came up when I was reading the text, not really a response to Jesse, but more like to enlarge a bit the discussion about AI. Okay. Can you see it well?
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Good here.
So yeah, so I would like to put in some question that we really talk about so far about AI, which is the idea of bias, and I thought it was maybe a good timing with the started of talking about symbolic AI. So I think the idea seems interesting here because when we talk about including human symbolic into AI, then you also include bias. So I got like 3 quotes that are extracted from Minsky's paper that made me think about this. Like, I would just read them quickly. So the first, like, does the need to choose amongst action compel us to provide the machine with classification techniques or means of evolving them? The second one is, quote, what is required is clearly a list of blah, blah, blah. And I think the idea of list is really important here. And the third one was, suppose, for instance, that the machine prior experiments is summarized by a large collection of statements, some labeled good and some bad by some critical device. So this, so I just lost my note here. So hence the environment of the symbolic AI, and its strain is coming from developer and scientists themselves. But how and with what those AI are fed don't seem to be part of the research or not included into the research. And we can also find some more of that with other reading we had to do for today. With, for example, in the Mark Artist paper, I cite him, he said, to be capable of learning something, it must be first capable of being told. But so the question is like, then now, what do they tell it and who do they tell it? Of course, bias within is probably inevitable. However, there's some that are less problematic than others. And nowadays, we know that if we jump to nowadays problematic algorithms, we see that they use it mostly every field, from like getting a loan for houses to going to jail or to school. So, hence bias within them could have dramatic consequences. And I will just like to enlarge this also by talking about one of the pieces I've seen recently at the Curve in London. I don't know if any of you have seen them. There's this piece by Trevor Pagans, and he basically used a pattern recognition AI that classify images, and he did a large kind of degradé, which he start from like really basic pattern recognition techniques, like to recognize like apple or different type of fruits, which is working quite perfectly, except few glitches, and then going to more and more complicated and ambivalent ideas to end like to question about like recognizing terrorism or like detainees or criminal and lawyer and those kind of things. And the further we go into the installation, the further you see like glitches appearing and really highly problematic images infiltrating some categories of like, for example, criminals. And yeah, so for me, it was interesting to open it there because we have seen like, I mean, there's some famous example that went to the news recently also about like face recognition. And as Jesse pointed out, one of the main things of Minsky paper was this idea of pattern recognition into AI. So yeah, that was basically like a quick answer I wanted to, and also to say and to broaden this question into the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me. Oh, that's weird. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. It asked me to unmute twice, so I don't know if that's an idempotent operation or not. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to follow up with a few comments in response to some of the points that were raised. As Jesse signaled, the switch to a focus on search also, I think, led to a focus on certain problems and checkers and games more generally. And why are games so useful? Well, the possibility space can be very easily and explicitly delineated. For any given position, there at least exists the possibility of establishing an evaluation of saying how good is this position compared to another position. It may not be trivial to figure the answer to that question out for all comparisons of one position to another, but it's a very constrained problem. And there's no question as to what a successful completion of the task is. You win or you lose, and you win by a certain explicit amount. And especially once you can be computationally regimented very easily, they become very attractive problems to these symbolic AI people. When Jesse's talked about pruning trees, I don't think, it's not any surprise that people saw the combinatoric explosion of most games as being something that would be very hard to manage, because it was. The combinatoric explosion of chess made it very hard to conquer until Deep Blue. But there is a sub-point that I wanted to address, which is that with regard to Go, there was a very interesting development in between Deep Blue and and the sort of conquering of Go through deep learning, which is that there is the use of one of the big advances in computer Go playing was through the use of Monte Carlo methods. And what that means is that rather than trying to pick which branches of the tree to explore, which branches were more promising, Monte Carlo methods in some way take a dumber approach by saying, we're just going to take a possibility and explore branches at random statistically. We may have like dumb pruning mechanisms, but we aren't going to do anything fancy. We're literally just going to like flip a coin to say, this is the game will play out, and then we'll statistically average over them and say, well, this game, if you played random from this point on, you'd win 52% of the time. Whereas if you made this move, if you played randomly from here on in, you'd win, 60% of the time. And it turned out that actually did better than supposedly smarter heuristic methods of pruning trees. And the reason why I want to stress that is that it underscores how computers, how these sorts of intelligences don't necessarily advance by having their innards look like they're doing any more sophisticated reasoning. Jesse, not in with regard to your question, Jesse, not in a substantive way. Yes, in that it's random, but it's just a technique. I wouldn't say that there's a deep relation between them, other than people thinking that randomness can sometimes be really useful, and that falls under the general rubric of Monte Carlo methods. And I wrote an article on this, which I'll send around, because I think it's interesting that this problem that Minsky identified was solved, perhaps in a way that wouldn't especially make him happy, because not only was it not particularly symbolic, but it didn't involve anything considering utilizing what we might consider heuristics or even intelligence. And also, I think both stress the idea, Minsky stresses the idea of hierarchy, which I think Jesse spoke to, the hierarchy of reasoning. And if you read the Margaret Bowden excerpt from this week, I think she gives an overview of an argument that was even existing within the symbolic AI community of hierarchy versus heterarchy. Heterarchy being something somewhat closer to the model that we saw in cybernetics. I don't want to say too close, but one in which there's not a strictly more highly regulated organization of layers where sort of reasoning is sent up and sent down. And that also comes into play when you have roboticists like Rodney Brooks in the 1980s, who we aren't going to read, but who also, I think, wanted to focus on less hierarchical organizations where you can sort of see the intelligence bubbling up. Hierarchy, I think, is very appealing simply because of its elegance and because it resembled how computers were actually being made at the time. You have abstraction layers, and you can verify and test them in isolation and know that they're doing exactly what you think they do. So it's not surprising that one would think, okay, well, a hierarchical situation is going to give itself over to more sophistication. So what are the advantages of hierarchy? Well, we'll see. More broadly, I want to add some comments on the Minsky paper in the context of it as a response to cybernetics, and in many ways a rejection of it, and at the very least a shift in emphasis. And there are four shifts I want to isolate. First, there's a shift from a consideration of real life biological situations to artificial or contrived situations. And the picture that Jesse showed of Minsky in his little lab, I think, is a nice illustration of that. The use of these laboratory situations as test grounds for AI. You're starting to look less at biological and environmental models and test cases, and more conditions that can be created for the computers that exist at the time, which are quite advanced in processing relative to what you had before, but considerably more limited in terms of anything resembling sensory modalities, which they more or less don't have. No one's sticking temperature sensors onto mainframes. Second, there's a rejection of, broadly speaking, of the information theoretical approach, and a rejection of the emphasis on statistical methods of filtering and processing. And here's on page 18 of the Minsky paper. It says, in spite of the space given here for their exposition, I'm not convinced that such incremental or statistical learning schemes should play a central role in our models. They will certainly continue to appear as components of our programs, but I think mainly by default. The more intelligent one is the more often he should be able to learn from an experience something rather definite, e.g. to reject or accept the hypothesis or to change a goal. The obvious exception is that of a truly statistical environment in which averaging is inescapable. But the heart of problem solving is always, we think, the combinatorial part that gives rise to searches, and we think should usually be able to regard the complexities caused by noise as mere annoyances, however irritating they may be. This is, in the middle of this paper, this is a statement of a defiantly rationalist mindset. That yes, we may have these mathematical models sort of going on what appears to be almost autopilot, but come on, you think you can get to, come on, Minsky says, you think you can get to intelligence just through those? You got, no, you got to like, the creature's got to be like entertaining these thoughts and saying, I got this hypothesis, I got to change this goal. And implicit in this is he's saying is like, look, this is not some emergent behavior. This is something the creature is doing. What is the creature doing? It's thinking. The organism is thinking. Even to the extent that you can open it up and look in it, and it's like, oh, look, maybe the organism didn't do anything, but yeah, it just confirmed this hypothesis or just strengthened this hypothesis. And in a way, the Bayes nets, which probably too much to get into, but they're basically, Bayes networks are belief networks that sort of increase and decrease probability of various propositions, and there's sort of a peculiar hybrid between sort of a feedback approach and a more semantic reasoning approach. But even his attraction to Bayes nets, it's okay, well, perhaps we have these somewhat stochastic processes, Minsky says, but we're still working towards confirming or denying hypotheses. It's a very positivistic model. It's a very rationalistic model. It's a very classically Cartesian model, all of those things. And it's interesting because Minsky doesn't lead with this, but when he says it so strongly that you can sort of see where this is going. And leading on from that, the third shift is the introduction of and this is almost a necessary consequence of the previous, which is that the semantics as a core part of the problem of AI. The internal semantics of an organism are no longer something to be factored out as a part of a black box or considered as an emergent consequence of the workings of neurons. Semantics are now more or less fundamental. And Jesse had one quote here, and I'm going to quote another one where Minsky talks about names. This is on page 11. But we will also want to use complex descriptions or computed names. These are constructed for classes by processes which will depend on the class definitions. To be useful, they should reflect some of the structure of the things they designate, abstracted in a manner relevant to the problem area. The notion of description merges smoothly into the more complex notion of model. As we think of it, a model is a sort of active description. It is a thing whose form reflects some of the structure of the thing represented, but which also has some of the character of a working machine. And what I want to stress, the process of naming is, Minsky doesn't paint it as trivial, but the process of naming is extremely complex and misleading, because how is it that one assigns a name or a label to something? You've already gone through a process of pattern recognition, of grouping, of excision, of irrelevant characteristics, all of these things that the cyberneticists were focusing on. And it's not that Minsky isn't aware of this. It's just that he's putting the stress much more on, yeah, we can do that, but what do we do once we've gotten these labels? What can we do with these labels? In some way, I think that it is fair to say that he is begging the question in some way by saying, well, assuming we already have the Kantian faculty of judgment, what can pure reason do? And let's just build pure reason first, because the rest of it's pretty easy. And of course, what his response is that, well, the cyberneticists have overstated the whole, put too much focus on the functionalist, quasi-behavioralist, paradigm of judgment, learning, whatever, and they need to pay more attention to the conceptual apparatus of pure reasoning, of pure reason. And isn't it great how Kant comes into everything? And finally, there's the emphasis on and this also falls out, the emphasis on a linear and explicit problem-solving process, often hierarchical, rather than problem-solving emerging, sort of from a process, from mathematical processes that just happen to give rise to it through evolutionary or homeostatic mechanisms that are primarily methods of non-semantic organization. And here's Minsky on page 20. It is Many workers in the area of self-organizing systems and random neural nets do not feel the urgency of this problem. Suppose that 1 million decisions are involved in a complex task, such as winning a chess game. Could we assign to each decision element 1/1,000,000th of the credit for the completed task? In certain special situations, we can do just that. For example, in these machines where the connections being reinforced are to a sufficient degree independent. But the problem-solving the problem-solving ability is correspondingly weak. So here he is saying, it's like, look, no matter how much you sort of put neurons or whatever individual elements together, there's got to be something over and above. And it's so much a classic appeal to the, oh, the magic's got to happen somewhere, right? And that argument is very old, and it hasn't gone away. And it still hasn't gone away, even though symbolic AI itself is fairly in abeyance. Nonetheless, a lot of the problems we're seeing with deep learning today have caused people to say, perhaps not that self-organizing and random neural nets are bad or wrong, but they do have limitations, and some magic has got to be reintroduced. And perhaps, perhaps some sort of symbolic and semantic mechanism will help. Maybe something else, but the argument is still there. So the larger question is, why has the center of gravity shifted? Why? Because, well, aside that Minsky and McCarthy are charting out a very different path. And aside from the sociological issues that Jesse and Aladdin have both spoken to, and Minsky's and McCarthy's obviously strong personalities, as well as Wiener's, I think, increasing self-marginalization, because he I think, really started refusing to have anything to do with the Defense Department. It wasn't as though the Defense Department hadn't funded cybernetics, but Wiener became increasingly radical, and I think did cordon himself off, and falling out with his erstwhile allies probably did not help either. But from us leaving those questions aside, I think that another reason is the increasing presence of the actual computer, to which Minsky references in turn when he talks about the quote Jesse gave about time sharing and mainframes. And although these machines were huge and unwieldy and primitive, I believe that the ability for researchers to write, yes, the PDB-6, nice machine. I mean, let me say, look, had I been around at the time, had I learned Lisp, had I seen Lisp, I would have said, it's amazing, I want to program in Lisp. Lisp is a pretty amazing language, and everyone should give it a try. Try Clojure if Lisp is too annoying to you. But are there any Haskell fans in this class? Okay, Haskell is sort of like Lisp, but too much Lisp, so that's what I'm wondering. Anyway, I think the ability, the actual dawn of these languages and the ability to actually write programs and punch them in and run them, which is not being done by the cyberneticians, I think it shifted the center of gravity to a more practical standpoint in a hurry for the researchers and for the funders. There's nothing preventing cyberneticians from writing programs that modeled phenomena from a cybernetic viewpoint, but the computers at the time lacked anything in the way of sensory modalities or ways to respond to the world beyond sheer computation and numerical punch card output. And even beyond that, with regard to von Neumann's statement that this model would be larger than the universe, they're limited in how much they can do. If Minsky's talking about, look, even with checkers, you're going to have problems pruning these trees. We haven't yet seen, they aren't yet at all certain that computers are going to explode, doubling their processing capacity every 18 to 24 months. So, they're worried, they're thinking, we've got this, it can do amazing things, and the cyberneticians are twiddling their thumbs on things that they can't even program. And so these huge mainframe machines that have, certainly a Benjaminian aura around them, are in fact the most disembodied artificial organisms that had been created to that point. Maybe the most disembodied organisms, period, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, Gray Walter's primitive robot turtles were much more embodied and embedded than ENIAC or UNIVAC or anything IBM built, or the PDP. But these mainframes could do far more work computationally. You could program them instead of them sort of responding through analog means. And so we have this strange side of Praxis once more leading theory by the nose, even though it's leaning it in this more Cartesian abstracted direction. And I don't even think that's a paradox. I just think it's a little ironic. Just as cybernetics was a reaction to the reality of general purpose computers, symbolic AI feels like a reaction to the reality of programming and the ability to program these general purpose computers, by which I mean the ability for civilians and researchers to write programs and run them without first having to get cleared by the Pentagon or Bletchley Park or MI6. There's an interesting and hidden segue here from cybernetics to symbolic AI, and it has to do with the notion of selection and ironically the ignorance of semantics. Symbolic AI comes out far more directly from the Vienna Circle of Logical Positivism. And one figure associated, and that's why we're reading Carnap as part of this, and we'll discuss him next week. One figure associated with that, with the Vienna Circle, who wasn't really part of symbolic AI, is Noam Chomsky, who was definitely around at this time. He's talking to everyone, but he's not really involved in this, in AI per se. And yet his notion of universal grammar is fundamentally one of selection. Given some overall innumerable list of possible syntactic grammars, switches are flipped on and off in the mind to make our mind absorb one particular grammar, and that of the language we're learning to speak. And I think it is impossible that this was not informed by the general emphasis on selection and not necessarily probability, but certainly enumeration and trees of the time. That is how things were being modeled, and I think that was a core influence on the concept of universal grammar. Chomsky is very explicit that he is ignoring semantics, which he thinks is just too hard of a problem. And as it turns out, he was right. But his notion of syntax is oddly reminiscent of Ashby's obsession with selection, except here the selection is made from some kind of overall list that is baked into our brain, rather than one based on an ad hoc assessment of pragmatic possibilities. And that, in turn, is closer to what the symbolic AI people want, where they say, okay, look, we're going to be enumerating possibilities in a rationalistic and explicit way rather than trying to glean them from the environment. And so I'll say, ultimately, cybernetics was somewhat agnostic on the question of whether the book of nature was written in the language of logic. It insisted that nature could be modeled through formal logic and mathematics, but it shied away from metaphysical claims beyond that. Symbolic AI performs a Kantian turn on that and says the world can still be modeled in formal logic, but that's less important than the contention that thought can be modeled in formal logic, and moreover that human thinking is tantamount to formal logic, even if its results are not themselves always logical in the sense that we think of them. In other words, a creature can be irrational and act irrationally, but its mechanisms have this formally logical characteristic to it. And I think that's where I'd like to leave off now, and we're going to get to the physical symbol systems hypothesis of Herbert Simon next week. It would be good. It would be good to start reading the AI winter readings. We probably are going to talk about symbolic AI actually do the symbolic AI readings, the AI winter readings, because they're very closely related to symbolic AI. There are not too many of them, and if we can polish up symbolic AI next week, that would be super. If you have not sent your presentation preferences or your paper topics to me, please do so as soon as humanly possible. I may have to start assigning paper. I may have to start assigning presentation topics soon, if for those people who haven't sent me them yet. And you probably don't want that to be done, because you are almost certainly would much rather pick a paper rather than get whatever I might assign. Any final questions? I unfortunately have I have two young automata to take care of, so I actually am a little running today. But any final questions I can answer quickly?
Yes, it's basically repetition or a summary to get it very clear. The difference between the cybernetic approach and the symbolic approach. And if I understood that in a right way, that for the symbolic approach, that logic and semantics are irreducible to a functionalism that the cyberneticists emphasize, and they say, okay, basically logic and semantics is irrelevant. We are just doing functionalism, and
I mean, yeah, I mean more so. But yeah.
Like, okay, logic and semantics can be studied, but they are not.
They're posterior to
like
our science. Yeah.
Ontologic, maybe one could say ontologically derivative, and
Yes.
not.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so logic and semantics, either they always go together. Either one, one doesn't focus on them or say they are irreducible.
I would say I would say the symbolic AI people are definitely making a strong claim. The cyberneticists, I guess, have the luxury of saying it's not important. You know, because I think in some ways the cyberneticists are, there's probably like this ghost of behavior, of hardcore behaviorism that they don't want to touch, and because they're talking about the mind and the brain, they're thinking, okay, look, we're working at a low level here, so you know these things are happening. It's just they aren't primary. So they can say, oh yes. I'm sure we'll get to logic and semantics eventually, but there's so much cybernetics work to be done first. That's I guess how I would say it. And the symbolic AI people are saying, no, you've put the cart. Well, if you have not put the cart before the horse, you have at least left out a core part of the problem, without which you're not going to get anymore. Okay. All right. Thank you. I will see you next week. Email me with any questions, and enjoy the frigid winter of symbolic AI.
Thanks, David.
Bye.
Thank you.